Welcome to this free Godot 2D Beginners course. During this 1-hour tutorial, you will be learning how to use Godot for creating 2D games. If you want to go deeper into 2D game development and gain comprehensive knowledge to use Godot like a pro, head to skillademia.com and get access to our full Godot 2D course. Now, let's begin.
Hello! In this course, you'll learn how to use sprites, tile maps, and UI controls to create a game similar to the Electronic Arts classic Legacy of the Ancients. In so doing, you'll pick up a bunch of techniques that you can use to create your own 2D games in the future. But first, a bit about me. My name is Steve Karstensen, and I've been a professional game developer for a little over 20 years, with extensive experience in both the Unity and Godot game engines, as well as a handful of other programming languages. All great journeys begin with a single step, though, so let's head on into the first lesson and install Godot. The first thing that we need to do is to install Godot. In order to do this, you can either get it from Steam, or the more recommended way is to go to godotengine.org, and you will find a link to the latest version at the top of the page. So click on that, and we're going to be using the x64 64-bit version, although if you are on a different operating system, feel free to get whichever executable is relevant for your OS. It's also available on various distribution platforms like itch or Steam or the Epic Game Store. We will not be using the .NET version because we're not going to be using the C# compatibility, so simply download Godot.engine and ideally make a donation. They work very hard and they could probably use it. All right, Godot is a very small executable, so once it's downloaded, simply open the archive. And if you're using Windows, you can simply copy the program wherever it needs to go. You can put it on your desktop, or I like to put Godot into its own folder. As you can see, I have various versions of Godot already installed, and it could not hurt to create a shortcut as well. Once you have Godot installed and you have a shortcut set up on your desktop, just double-click the icon, and you might get a security warning, but it's okay. And once Godot loads up, you will immediately see the project manager. From here, we're going to get started and create our project. Now that we've got Godot installed and booted up, it's time to create our first project. So once Godot is loaded, the first thing you're going to be presented with is the Projects tab. This is where all of your projects, once you create them, are going to be stored and managed. And from here, you can edit or run or do various things to existing projects. But since you'll have just started, you won't have as many projects as I do. So you're going to need to click New and type in the name of your project. It should be something memorable. I'm going to name the project after the game that we're going to be creating, which is Legacy of the Ancient Questor. And then you are going to click Browse and decide which folder you're going to put it in. It's going to go somewhere memorable for you. And then if you need to create a subfolder under the project that you put it under, you can click Create Folder. And once you do that, you'll see that the name of the project has been appended to the folder path that you're going to use. But that's a little redundant in my case, so I'm not going to do that. You can leave the renderer and version control metadata with whatever defaults Godot defaults you to. We're going to use compatibility mode, or it's recommended to use compatibility mode for the renderer, because then that way when you export your game to run on different platforms, whether it be Windows, Android, whatever, you stand the greatest chance of everything working. And you can see the various details of what the renderer offers here. So for example, if I do forward plus, it's advanced 3D graphics, only works on desktop, so you'll not be able to export a forward plus renderer project to Android, for example. It can scale to large complex scenes. And then if we go to mobile, this is what is scaled down. So this is what you would be using if you were eventually going to port your game to Android. If you want to get maybe not the best of both worlds, but certainly the most agreeable between the two, again, stick with compatibility. So that's what we're going to do here. We are not going to be using version control, so it doesn't really matter what your version control metadata is, but eventually it would be a good idea to learn Git so that you can effectively back up your projects. And then we'll click Create and Edit. Once Godot loads to the main editor, you're going to be presented with this window. The first thing you want to do is familiarize yourself with this layout. Most of it is customizable, but we are going to be leaving things as is to keep them from getting complicated. Before we get started on our project, though, there's a couple of project settings that we have to, well, set in order to make sure that Godot can handle our screen resolution and various other aspects of the pixel art project that we're going to be created. So go up under Project and select Project Settings, and then select under the display category, Window. This is where we're going to set the resolution of our game and how Godot is going to handle it if we attempt to do things like resize the window or put it in full screen or whatever. For simplicity's sake, we are going to leave the game in windowed mode for development, and you can change that to full screen if you want before you export your final project. So that would be under Size and Mode, and which is currently set to windowed, and then normally you're going to want to make it exclusive full screen if you want it to take up the entire screen. But again, we're going to leave ours as windowed. Since we're going to be making a retro style low resolution game, we're going to set our viewport width and viewport height to 640 by 360. This is a fairly low resolution that is still higher than the resolution of the games that we're trying to emulate, but still low enough that it gives it that retro feel. Also, make sure that your stretch mode is set to viewport, your aspect ratio is keep, and your scale mode is integer. Or this will all ensure that Godot will not try to do any kind of resizing or filtering and keep your pixel art crisp. Once all that is done, open the advanced settings and check towards the bottom of the size category for window width override and window height override. And we're going to set those to 1280 by 720. You can make them larger if you want, depending on the size of your display. But what this does is it resizes the window while keeping the resolution set to what we originally had. So you're going to see the pixels within the game larger than you would normally if the window height and width were the same as they would be for the viewport. Then you would have a 1-to-1, and we want to scale it up so that it's not tiny while we're developing it. Once you've done that, you can close the advanced settings and then go down to rendering and textures and click on that. And since we are going to be using low resolution pixel art bitmaps for all of our textures, we want to change the default texture filter from linear to nearest. This will keep us from having to worry about our textures being blurry when they're blown up to larger sizes. And with all of that done, we can close out of the project settings menu. Now that you've got your project set up, we're going to take a quick tour of the Godot user interface, and then we are going to get started on our project by creating a title screen that will allow us to get into the game once we press the start button. So your user interface should look like this once you come back from the project settings. And up near the top of the window, you're going to see 4 tabs related to the different parts of the Godot application. We are specifically and exclusively going to be working in 2D, so you can press the 2D tab and you will get the 2D view. Once you do that, you'll see that your 2D view, which is currently zoomed to 100, so if we go into the upper left-hand corner here, we can expand that a bit just to give us a little bit more real estate to work with. And you'll see that the play area is bordered in this purple rectangle. This is your screen area as dictated by your project settings. In fact, if you go back to project settings and change the window resolution of your project, you'll see this purple rectangle expand or contract depending on how large you make your window. And once we run our game, this is going to project to the final window or full screen depending on whether or not you selected window mode or full screen mode for your project in your project settings. But hopefully you selected windowed so that when we run the game, we'll be able to see what we're doing and easily switch back to the Godot editor. So it's recommended to stick in windowed mode, at least for the purposes of these lessons. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the inspector, and this is where you're going to be changing properties of the various nodes and resources once you add them to your scene. On the left-hand side, you'll see 2 very important windows. In the upper left, you'll see what is called the scene tree, and this is the contents of the scene that you're currently working in. Godot has 2 primary building blocks in its scene structure, that being a scene, and then within a scene, it has a tree of nodes, and those nodes can be parented to or have children, other nodes. And this is what is going to be processed and rendered in order to make up your game scene. 9 times out of 10, game scenes can be things like levels in your game, but they can also be user interfaces, characters, bullets, weapons. Everything in Godot is a scene, and every scene is made up of nodes. In fact, if you want to get kind of meta about it, a scene is a node, and a node is a scene. So you can essentially think of them as the same thing. There are many, many different types of nodes. The 4 that Godot gives you as default starting choices are 2D scenes, 3D scenes, user interface, which is what we're going to start with in a moment, or other node. So before we look at that, let's look at the file system tab in the lower left-hand corner. This is where your entire project is going to reside. When you create a project in Godot, you are going to get a directory, which you specified when you created the project, as you did in the previous lesson. And within that project, you are going to see, at least in the file system window, you're going to see the resources folder. The resources folder is essentially a reference to the project folder. So anything that you put into the resource directory in Godot is going to show up in that folder, and anything that you put into that folder is going to show up in your resource directory, and vice versa. So if we look at our directory, this is a fresh project directory, completely new after having just been created. And you'll notice that there's a bunch of stuff in here related to internal Godot handlings. So it's got a Godot directory. Then there's 2 files for source control, which in our case is Git, but since we're not using source control, it doesn't really matter. If we were using source control, Git would be using these files. Then we have icon.svg, which is the Godot icon, the Godot logo, which comes as part of the default of every Godot project. In fact, if we were to build and run this project right now, the system icon for our application would be this image. And it's also kind of a bit of a running gag among Godot developers to use the logo.svg as temporary graphics for just about everything that they do initially. So we're actually not going to be doing that, but you'll see it if you watch any Godot tutorials on YouTube, guaranteed. The next file is a .import file, and whenever you import any kind of resource into a Godot project, Godot will create one of these import files. You can completely ignore them. So, they are used internally, and if you were to delete this one, Godot would just make a new one because it would assume it hasn't created or it hasn't imported the asset yet. So basically, Godot uses them as a way to keep track of which assets have been imported, plus the settings for the import. Like I said, you can basically ignore them. And project.godot is the project file for your project. So we're going to create a directory here. Now we could do it directly within our file explorer, or we can do it in Godot. So we're going to do it in Godot, and we're going to right click with our mouse on the resources folder and the create new folder. And we're going to call it graphics because this is where we're going to put our images. And because I like to be neat, I'm going to make a subfolder specifically for our title screen, and that's where we're going to put the graphics related to our title screen. Now you can left click on this arrow and expand the directory so that you can see the directories underneath it. And you can do that for all of your folders and subfolders, just like you can in a normal file browser. So this is pretty much the same as working in Windows or Mac or whatever. And once we've got that, we're going to go into the resources folder for the project. And if you downloaded supplementary materials for this course, you will have these graphics available. But if you don't have the graphics available, or if you want to use your own, that's perfectly acceptable. Just follow along as best you can. So the image that I'm going to use as the background for our title screen is tree, bunch of numbers, underscore 1280. So we're going to copy that and we're going to go into our project. And now you can see we've got our graphics folder here. So we're going to go into title, the title folder, and we're going to paste it. And then once you go back to Godot, you'll see that it has imported the asset and it is now available within our game to be used. So now that we've got that, we're going to start creating our user interface. When you first start up a Godot project, you have absolutely no scenes set up in your scene tree. So you have to add one. We're going to add a user interface, which is a control. All user interface elements in Godot, whether they be drop-down boxes, buttons, graphics, whatever, are all based off of the control node. Godot is an object-oriented, or uses C++, which is an object-oriented language, as its underlying code, so there's going to be a lot of inheritance in the node tree. Now, a control is, again, the base node for all graphical interfaces, and there are a number of things you can do with controls to set them up so that they will be part of the user interface. The most basic one is that you'll need to know the size of the control. Now, as you can see, since we actually have a node highlighted in our scene tree, the inspector now has properties for that node. And oh boy, there are a lot of them. So we're not going to go over all of these, obviously, but we're going to go over as many of them as we need to in order to create our user interface. So the first thing we're going to do is actually rename our control. And we can do that the same way we would do it in the file system. So either long double click on it or right click and rename. And we're going to call it title screen. By default, this control is the entire size of our window. As you may recall, the purple rectangle dictates the amount of screen real estate that we've got to work with. And this yellow rectangle with these dots in the corners and on the sides indicate the rectangle that the control will take up. So it defaults to the entire screen. If we didn't want it to be the entire screen, we could drag it and resize it in any way that we want, either using the corners or using the handles on the sides. But we do want it to be the size of the entire screen. So one way to get that back quickly is to go up to the presets for the anchors and left click on that, and you are going to get this little drop down that shows you various forms of how to align your control. So you can make it upper left center, upper left right, the entire top of the screen, and so on. The one we want, and one of the most useful ones in my opinion, is full rect. So we left click on full rect, and we are now back to the entire size of the screen. So within our control, our title screen is the entire control that encompasses the entirety of our title screen. So we're going to be adding subcomponents to that in order to make up our title screen. The first one that we want to add is our background image. So if we right click on title screen, we will see add child node, and we can also add a child node with Control A. So left click on that, and we'll get the create new node window. And this is where you tell Godot which node that you want to add. In our case, we want to add a texture rect. And then once that comes up, we're going to create it. And now we've got a texture rect. So we're going to rename this as well. Right click, rename. And this is going to be background image. In fact, I almost always recommend you intuitively name your nodes, because once your scene hierarchies start getting extremely complicated, you're not going to remember what is what. So always rename your nodes. The only exceptions that I will do for renaming nodes is margin containers, because most of the time I use them for spacers, which we'll see how to do in a little bit. But again, 9 times out of 10, you want to rename your nodes. So we have a background image, and we want our background image to take up the entire size of the control. Now, by default, basic controls do not resize their children. So in order to tell the background image, hey, I want you to be the entire size of the screen, we again have to go back up to our anchor presets and select full rect. Once we've got that, we can go back to our file system, and now you can see that the background image is highlighted in your inspector, and if it's not, you can just click on it again to get back to it. And we're going to assign a texture. So we're going to left click and drag our tree over to the texture setting, and that'll give us our texture. And it is way too big, because this texture is 1280 by 854 pixels, and our window, if you did it according to my existing project settings, is only 640 by 360. So we need to make this thing much smaller. As an aside, in order to navigate around the main viewport, you can use your mouse wheel to zoom in and out. And if you hold down the middle mouse button, you can move the window around. You can also use the scroll handles on the side. So I've zoomed out a bit so that we can see that our graphic is now way too large and the control has actually resized to the size of the image. So we're going to go back to texture rect and we've got expand mode. And expand mode tells us what to do with the texture in order to resize it to the control. So we want to change it to fit width. Boom. Now what that'll do is that will resize the image such that the width of the texture is the same width as the control. But this is not perfect because it actually squishes it in the horizontal, which may be fine depending on the image. But if you don't want that to happen, you can change it to fit width proportional, which doesn't actually do anything. So let's try fit height proportional. There we go. Now we've got the image keeping the exact same aspect ratio. And we can also set the stretch mode. So the stretch mode right now, it automatically scales the image, but we can also change it to keep aspect centered, which is a good idea anyway, because what that will do is it will keep the aspect ratio of the texture, but it will also keep the texture centered within the control. So 9 times out of 10 for a background image, you're going to want some form of keep aspect centered or fit width, fit height, depending on the size of the image and how it looks to you. Now we've got a image that looks pretty good. So before we go any farther, we're going to save our work. And you can either do that with your standard Control S, or you can go under the scene menu and select Save Scene. The Godot will then it will then ask you where you want to save it. And I like to put all my scenes in a individual scenes folder to keep them separate from my graphics. So we're going to create a folder called Scenes. And within that folder, we're going to create another folder called UI. And UI is generally where I like to put my menus and graphics and that sort of thing. It's always a good idea to keep your project organized so that you can find things easily. This isn't the only way to organize a project, but it keeps things pretty good. So as you can see, Godot automatically fills in the title of the file or the name of the file based on the name of the node. You can change this if you want, but we're not going to. So just hit save, and now we've got our title screen. And this is good so far, but we're still not quite there yet. It's a bit bare bones and doesn't tell you the name of the game or let you actually do anything with it. So let's add some text. We're going to go under title screen again. Now we could simply drag what's called a text label into our control and manually center it, but we're not going to do that. We're going to be a little bit fancy about it because the real magic of Godot's user interface controls are what's called containers. So let's add a margin container, and I could type it in up here, but as you can see, I've already been doing a little bit of work, and Godot remembers the most recent nodes that you've used to keep you from having to research them all the time. So since I've already been using margin containers, let's just click on that and we'll create a new margin container. And I'm going to call it content because that's what it will be. Now we could place the background image within the control, but we don't want to do that because as I mentioned before, containers will actually resize all of the controls that are placed within the container. And we don't want to resize our background image. We want to leave it where it is. So we are going to, again, make our margin container the size of the screen. And we are going to add things to our margin container. Now, with a margin container, if you were to add a node, and let's add a text label. If you were to add a label directly to the margin container, it's going to be centered within the container. So if you click on a node, it will show you the bounding rectangle of the node. So this is how much space the node takes up. So if we look at the label, it's going to be only as large as the label needs to be to handle the text. And then it's going to automatically be as wide as the container because that's just what labels do generally is they will resize to the size of the container unless you change their stretch mode, which we'll look at in a moment. But first of all, let's just throw some text in here. So the name of our game is Legacy of the Ancient Questor. And why is that the name of our game? Well, if you're as old as I am, you may remember the old Commodore 64 computers, and there were a handful of classic games called Legacy of the Ancients, which was a spiritual sequel to the game called Questor. And we are essentially reproducing both of these games, or at least we're writing a game very similar to both of these games. So the name is kind of a nod to that. But if you don't like the name, feel free to call the game whatever you would like. Now, within a label, you can change the horizontal and vertical alignment of the text. So if you click on your node and go under properties, you'll see horizontal alignment. So let's change that to center. And vertical alignment, for most fonts, it doesn't really matter if it is centered or not, but I always like to make it centered just for completion. And this is kind of a boring font. We don't like this font, so we're going to change the font. And changing the font and all of the font text and size and everything else is very simple. So with your label highlighted in the selector, click the little drop-down arrow and then select New Label Settings. It is also possible to create an independent label settings file that we could use for multiple labels across the course of the project, but we're not going to do that here. So select New Label Settings and then click on the word Label Settings. And that will open the label settings and allow you to change the properties. So we're going to change the font, the outline, and the shadow. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the font. So if you go back to the resources, you'll see a folder called font_pix3mccby, and we're going to go in there and we're going to use the Allegard font. So copy the Allegard font. You're going to want to put it in your project folder. So let's just, since we're already here in Explorer, we'll create a new folder. And if we create a folder here, Godot is smart enough to pick it up. So we'll call this one Fonts. We will call it Fonts with an S. And then we will paste our font in here. Godot can use TrueType fonts. I believe it can also use bitmap fonts. I'm not sure if it can use any other formats, but experiment. And if you drop a font in there that Godot doesn't recognize, then it doesn't use that file format. Godot is actually extremely robust in terms of what file formats it can pick up. Most of them are open source because Godot itself is open source. So copyrighted formats like MP3 are usually a no-go, but stuff like OGG or WAV for audio is usually the best bet. So if you're not sure about what file types Godot supports, you can either consult the documentation or just drag the file into your project folder and see if it recognizes it. If it doesn't recognize it, it won't come up at all. So now we've got our fonts, and now that we've got a font, we can change our label settings. So under font, you can see that there is a spot for a font. So we're going to drag our font into there. And now you see that the font has been changed. This is way too small. So let's bump up. Whoa, that's way too big. Let's bump up the size of the font. And the color of the font, white, is fine. We are going to change the outline of the font. Let's give it a 2-pixel outline and click on the color to bring up the color selector. And we're going to change the outline to black just so that it stands out against the background slightly. Let's make that a little bigger. 3, 4. If you ever want to reset your window to the exact size it is, just left click once on the zoom to setting, and that will snap it back to 100. Then we are going to add a shadow. So let's change the shadow color and actually make it visible. So we'll crank up the alpha, which is the transparency, and then we'll make the size of the shadow 5, and we will change the offset slightly to, there we go. That looks good. Now, as you can see, the label is dead in the center of our screen, and we don't want that. But since we're using a margin container, we're not able to actually move the control. In fact, if we go under layout, Godot is going to tell us, hey, this node is a child of a container, which basically means that any changes, normally you would be able to make changes here as to where it goes, but you can't. Because if you do, Godot is just going to snap them right back once the container recalculates everything. But since we're using a content container, or since we're using a margin container, one of the things that we can do is change, wait for it, the margins, which means that we can actually resize the space available to us within the control. So if you click your content container, if you go under theme overrides, constants, you'll see where you can place your margins. So let's change all of the margins. We'll enable all of them so that we can affect all of them. And let's just give them all a nice offset of 20. Now, as you can see, as I'm doing this, the positioning of the internal control is changing to accommodate the margins. And if we now highlight the internal control, you can see that the width has been adjusted inward to account for the margins. So now we are going to add a set of buttons to allow the player to load a new game and navigate to a credits screen. And in order to do that, we have to add a number of buttons. But what we're going to do first is we're going to organize all of this stuff by using one of the 2 most handy user interface layout components, the vertical box separator. or the vertical box container rather. So again, click on your content margin container, right click, add child node, and type in VBox. The VBox container and the HBox container are absolutely invaluable for creating properly laid out menus, especially the VBox container. If you ever need a stacked row of things, the VBox container is your node. So we now have a VBox container, but the label is not part of it. So we want to make the label part of it. So if left click on label and then we drag it under the VBox container, it is now a child of the VBox container. And if we click on the VBox container, we can again see that it has taken on the margins of the margin container. So the content container is the size of our entire screen, and then the VBox container would be the size of our entire screen, but it takes the 20 pixel margins inward, the margin container, named content, and so now it is smaller. So we are going to add a couple of things. The first thing we're going to add is another margin container. And as you can see now, this second margin container is directly under the label. And I forgot to change the title of our label, so let's call that title. So this margin container currently doesn't have any vertical size. And that's because margin containers by default are not set to take up as much space as they possibly can. So we're going to change that. So we're going to go with the margin container highlighted. We're going to go under layer. Then we're going, or layout rather. Then we will do container sizing. And this determines or how big your control is going to be in both the horizontal and vertical directions. So you have a number of selections. The most common ones are fill, and then you also have shrink and and especially for vertical, in this case, the option to expand. So if I were to change horizontal to shrink center, then you'll see that the horizontal size of the control has now shrunk to the minimum size that it would possibly be. And since this container has no controls within it, there's nothing to size around, so it's going to be as small as it can possibly be, and we don't want that. So we actually do want it to fill, because we want it to take up the entire horizontal length of this. And vertically, we are going to check expand, which means that it is going to take up as much space as it possibly can, which means, in this case, the rest of the container. But we're not done yet. Let's call this spacer, just because. And now we want to create another container to hold our menu. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add another VBox container. And this is going to be our button menu. And again, as you can see, since it has no contents, it's as big as it needs to be. And since the spacer is also as big as it needs to be, the spacer is going to take up all the space that the other controls within the container do not take up. And in this case, since the button menu has nothing in it right yet, the spacer is going to take up the entire middle of the screen. So let's add 3 buttons to the container. So add child node and button. Now we've got a button. And you can either right click and select duplicate, or you can do Control D to duplicate a node. So we're going to make 3 buttons and we're going to rename them. The first one is going to be new game button. The next one is going to be load game button, and we're going to see how to load and save in a future lesson. Should probably call that load game button just for consistency. And then our third button is going to be credits. And it's just personal preference that I keep the name of the node, a lot of cases, within the name of the node. Even though you can see the icon here to show that this is a button, I still like to say, hey, this is a button. So as you can see, we now have 3 buttons that are as large as they need to be, resized to the size of the button menu container. And since they have no text, nothing at all, really, they are basically their minimum size. So with each button highlighted, we're going to go to text, and we're going to give it some text. So the new game button is going to have new game as its text. And as you can see now, the button has resized in order to accommodate the size of the font and the text within it. Then we've got load game and credits. Now we could leave the buttons like this, but they do take up the size, the entire size of the window, and we don't really like that. We actually want the buttons to be a certain size and off to the left. So I'm going to show you some clever tricks in order to get that spacing done correctly. First thing we're going to do is we are going to go back to our VBox container that contains our menu, and then we are going to add an HBox container. Then we are going to add another margin container to this HBox container. And again, we're going to go under Layout, Container Sizing. And in this case now, since it's an HBox container, we can horizontally expand the margin container. So we're going to expand it to the entire size of its parent container. And just as an aside, figuring out the proper sizing flags and layouts for a particular menu is kind of an art form. It may take you a while to get the hang of it. So as you're creating your own menus, just add things and play around with them and see how they work. But once you get the hang of it, you can create a UI, good-looking UI, very quickly. So we've got our HBox container, we've got our margin container. So now let's take our button menu and we will drag it into the HBox container, and it should drag directly under the button menu. So again, as an aside, the ordering of things within the VBox and the HBox container is the order that they appear in the tree. So as you can see in our VBox container, it's title, then spacer, and then HBox container. 1, 2, 3. And then for our HBox container, it's margin container and button menu. So we are almost there, but these buttons aren't quite as large as they could be, and that makes me a little sad. So let us change that. And we will do that by simply going back to the button menu and going to Layout, and again, Container Sizing, and we'll expand horizontal. And now the buttons are as large as the button menu container. And the button menu container is as large as it can be within the size of the HBox container. And since there are two elements in it, each one is half of the size of the HBox container. So here's our margin container, and here's our buttons, half and half. And now we have a very basic menu. We can still do more with this. So if you'll join me for the next lesson, I will show you how to create themes for your buttons so that all of your buttons in your game, or as many as you define, can share a common look, and you won't have to copy and paste the settings to each new button. It's great. So before we go anywhere, again, let's Control C or Control S to save our scene, our title scene. And again, join me in the next lesson and I'll show you how to make some themes.
Hi again! I hope you're enjoying this tutorial and already seeing the capabilities of Godot. If you want to explore the extended version of this course, visit skillademia.com, where you will find our complete Godot 2D course for beginners to advanced users, with more than 100 lectures and numerous practical projects for you to complete. Now, let's continue.
In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create a reusable theme that we're going to use to skin all of our buttons, and you can expand this to work with any UI component within your game to get a consistent look and feel across your entire application. So as you can see, we've got our very boring looking buttons from our previous lesson. So we're going to go down to our file system and create a new folder, and we're going to call it themes. And we're only going to make one theme here, but it's still good practice to keep all of your components well organized in separate subfolders and stuff like that, just to get into the habit of organizing things and keeping your project organization from getting away with you, or getting away from you, rather. So then we're going to right click and select Create New Resource, and that resource is going to be a theme. So resources are not nodes. Resources are basically data file formats, and there are resources for just about every kind of data that you might need in Godot. Things like materials or bitmaps or, well, themes, for example. We've already seen use of resources with the font and bitmap files that we've dragged into our texture properties in the inspectors. So let's create a new theme, and we're going to call it default theme, because this is the theme that we're going to be using across the entire game, unless we decide that we're going to use a different one. But this, again, will be our default theme. So we'll save it here. And once you do that, you will then see the theme editor in the bottom window. It will show up under its own tab, so you still have your output, debugger, audio, etc. And you can actually drag it by clicking and dragging on the border of that window. So what you can see here is how the default existing Godot theme already looks. So this theme is what makes our buttons look the way they do. Godot immediately or automatically applies this default theme to any user interface components that don't already have a theme assigned. So what we've done is we're basically taking the default theme and we've made a copy of it, and now we can use this theme just as is, but we don't want to do that. So as you can see, we've got previews of all of the user interface components available to Godot, and the one that we want specifically is the button. So we're going to change the buttons. So if we go over to the right-hand side, you can see the various properties available. We're going to right-click on the plus next to the type field, and that will give us the add item type dialog, and then we'll select button, and then we'll click add type. Now it's also possible to click the manage items button, then add items to the list, but we're not going to do that. So again, click this plus button right here and then select a button when it comes up. When that happens, you will then see properties, all of the properties that you can change for a button organized into tabs along the next row of the screen, or the next row of this particular widget. So in order to create a new font override, we need to click the plus button to add a new font definition. And then we're going to grab our Allegard font from the file system and drag it over into the font definition. And as you can see, that immediately updates all of the buttons, because all of the buttons use the same basic style for the most part. You can override them individually, but since, say, the toggle button, the disable button, whatever, since they all derive from button, in a lot of cases, they're going to share similar font styles and stuff like that. So the next part is actually more important. What we're going to do is we're going to change the background graphics of the button. In order to do that, we're going to go over to the Styles tab, and the ones that we are the most concerned with are hover, normal, and pressed. So we're going to start with normal, and we're going to click the plus button to override that. And here, we're going to change it to a new style box texture. And then we're going to click, if we click on the style box texture definition, we will see our style box texture in the inspector. So as part of this course, we've actually provided you with a set of resources to use. And the resources we're going to be working with, in case you want to go hunt down the creator on the internet, is Kenny. Kenny produces a lot of fantastic, freely available art assets for you to use in your own projects. So we're going to go under PNG, and we're going to be using the button square brown and button square brown pressed. So copy those into your project folder, and we're going to put them under graphics, new folder, UI, and paste. Now those graphics are available to us within Godot. First thing we're going to do is we are going to assign button square brown to the texture in our normal style box texture. As you can see, this actually makes a very bad looking texture. It's extremely stretched out, it's squashed, and that's because we haven't defined the texture margins correctly, because this texture is actually meant to be scaled as what is known as a 9-patch texture. So what it does, or what Godot will do, is it will divide the texture up into 9 slices, and then it will draw the outer borders of the texture such that they can scale to any size. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to edit the subregion. And normally what this means is that, first let's click on edit region. Normally what this means is that it's intended for you to use with user interface components where you have multiple components on one sprite sheet. So it is actually possible to, say, have 5 different button skins on a single bitmap, and then select the particular bitmap from the particular user interface component from within that bitmap to use here. But we're not doing that. We're going to keep this exact button file as our skin. So as you can see here, we don't actually have to do anything, and you can use your mouse wheel to scroll in and out. You can also use the zoom buttons here to zoom in and out. And it's a good idea, since we're doing pixel art, to make sure that we have pixel snap enabled. So this is the region that we want to use. We want to use the entirety of the bitmap as our button. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to expand the inner margins. And this part is a little weird. It took me a while to figure out. But if you expand the texture margins property and actually put values in each of the 4 properties, left, top, right, and bottom, and then go back to edit region, you now actually have editable margins within your defined region. So this is the top margin, and what we're going to do is we're going to set it such that only the very top border counts as the top margin. And this will be the part of the graphic that gets scaled when we stretch horizontally for the top of the bitmap. And we're going to do likewise for the bottom, although we've got a bit more graphic down here to compensate for. And then we'll do the similar for the left and the right borders, taking care to make sure that we account for this little graphical decoration here. And you can immediately see that our button now looks correct, at least for the normal view. We still have to update the hover and pressed, of course. In addition, it's a good idea to change the axis stretch to tile, although you don't necessarily have to. It depends on the graphics you're using. But that means that instead of stretching the parts of the bitmap that it's going to use, it will tile them instead. And you can play with that to see which works best for what you're trying to do. So for example, if I leave it as stretch in the vertical, I'm only going to get one of those graphical decorations because we're not tiling it, we're stretching it. But for a button, it doesn't really matter. So I'll leave it as tiled in both directions just to make it cleaner. Now for pressed, we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to use a different graphic. So the quickest way to do this is to expand using the arrow next to the normal style box that we've already done. And we're going to copy it, and then we're going to press the plus button to override the pressed, and then we're going to do paste. Now, caution, because we've copied the normal style, it's the same resource. It's not a copy of the resource, it is the resource. So if you change the texture under pressed, for example, it's going to change normal, which we don't want. So now that we've copied it, we're going to expand the menu and we're going to do make unique. And now that we've done that, we can do button square brown pressed and drag it over. And now we've got a new texture, and we have to change the margins slightly because this button is different. So we'll just drag this margin down a little bit and we are done. Well, we still have to do hover, but for hover, we want the button to actually look the way it does for normal. So we can just override that. And since we've already copied it, let's paste. And now hover, the button looks exactly the way it does. You can't really see it because of the zoom level here, but let's go back to our game. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tell the buttons that they're going to use this style. So the way to do that is we can highlight all 3 buttons, and we can do that by clicking on one and then shift clicking on the third one, which will give us all 3 of them. And then we will, in the inspector, we'll go down to theme, and we will drag our theme into the theme. And now we have 3 buttons that look as they should. Although they're not perfect, we can actually still play with them a little bit, and I'm going to do so. So we would actually like the text to be larger. So we could modify the theme, but we only want these particular buttons to have the larger text. So we can do that by going to theme overrides, font sizes, and then we check the box, and we'll change the font size to, let's say, 45. And whoa, that looks a lot bigger. And it looks good. So at this point, we'll Control S and we'll save our scene. And let's run our game. Why not? So there are 2 different ways to run your game. You can either run scenes individually. So in this case, since our game only has the one scene and we've already got it loaded, if we were to run this scene, it would be the equivalent of running the game. And that would be this button here. Or we could simply run the project. And if we do that, Godot is going to tell us, your Godot is going to tell you, mine isn't because I already said it. Godot is going to prompt you to pick the scene that you want to run as the base of your project. And it's going to, one of the options is going to be use current. So you can simply select use current scene, and then that will be set. So now you can see when we met, and it's very subtle here, but if you mouse over the buttons, then the button will highlight slightly. And if you press it, all right, so it looked like there was a slight glitch. It looks like I somehow accidentally swapped the textures for the pressed and not pressed buttons, but that has been fixed. So now if you run the scene and you press the buttons, they will actually react. You will notice, however, that when you press a button, it's going to gain the focus rectangle, and we don't want that for what we're trying to accomplish here. So again, let's select all 3 buttons, and then we will go under Focus, and we're going to change the mode to None. And that means that none of the buttons are going to be considered to be in focus by the game when we click on them, which is what we want. Now, depending on the kind of user interface functionality you want, you may not want to disable focus, especially if you want to provide the ability to, say, cycle through selected buttons with the tab key, or it really depends on your user interface. But for what we're trying to accomplish here, we're simply going to turn off focus. Join us in the next lesson when we add the final component to the title screen, which is the version number, although you can probably figure out how to do that yourself. So maybe you should give it a shot and then join me in the next lesson to see if you did it the same way I did. Okay, last but not least, to close out this chapter, we're going to put a programmable version number in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. We're going to highlight our title screen because we don't actually want to put the label inside the content container, because then it will move our buttons up, and we kind of like where they are right now. So we'll go to title screen, we'll add child node, and we will add a label, and we will name it version number. And we are going to change the version number's anchor to the lower left, and we're going to give it some default text. And we don't really like the way that looks, so let's change our label settings, same as we did for the buttons, or for our, well, the buttons, but primarily our original label here. We'll give it a font. And just to be interesting, let's change the color to something slightly more readable, like yellow. We can leave the font size the way it is, and we'll change the vertical alignment to center, and we'll leave the horizontal alignment as left. And just to be safe, let's expand the label a little bit. Normally, labels will resize themselves based on the text, depending on how you change the text overrun property. And as you can see here, I summoned the tooltip simply by hovering over the property's name. And this is incredibly useful. If you don't know what any of the properties do, just hover over the name, and nearly all of them have tooltips. Godot's documentation is actually extremely good and extremely in-depth. It's not perfect. There are some things that are still missing, but most of the stuff that you're going to be dealing with as a beginner is all there. So we now have our version number, and what we want to do is we want to be clever about this. We want the version number to automatically update whenever we change the version number. As you can see, it's right up against the border here, and we don't want that. So let's go to Layout, Transform, Position, and we'll give it a 10 pixel left-hand X value. That's a little bit better. Actually, let's nudge it upward a little bit in the Y direction. All right, here we go. So if you go under Project Settings, you'll see under the Config option, under Application, there's actually a space for version number. And we're not quite at version 1.0 yet. We've still got a lot of work to do yet. So let's call it 0.01. Version numbering is an inexact science. There are many different ways to keep track of the version number that you are working on. So I suggest that if you're interested in figuring out how to consistently number your versions, do a little reading on the internet, Google how to create version numbers or version numbering, and you'll get something. What I like to do in the beginning, especially when we're very, very early in development, I might call it, say, Alpha 1, because the alpha version of a game is usually the most bare bones of prototypes. And in fact, I think we're not even at a alpha yet, so let's call it Prototype 1. Now, this version number is a property available to us in our scripts. So we can actually read this string from Godot and put it in our version number label. So let's do that. If we highlight our version number label, and then we go up here to the attach script button, we could also right click on it and say attach script. So let's do that. You will get the attach a script dialog. And what we're going to do here is we're going to leave everything as it should be, all of our defaults, but we are going to change the path because, as I said before, it's usually good to organize things in a particularly straightforward way. And I like to keep all of my scripts separate from scenes and graphics. So we've got scripts, and then we'll create another folder under here. We'll call it UI. Actually, no, we'll call it title screen. And now that we're in here, we have our version number script. So we'll hit open. We'll hit open. And then, so our path is correct. Godot will tell us that it's going to create a new script file using the language GGScript. We're going to be using GGScript for all of the scripting in this course. It's a simple language, ideal for beginners. It's based on Python, if you're familiar with Python. And if you're not, that's okay too. And I will be teaching you the basics of GGScript, and you'll learn lots of interesting programming stuff over the course of this course. So hit create. And now you have a script. We are going to be extremely simple for this first script. We're not going to do a lot with it. The first thing that we need to do, and what I should have probably done, is actually do a template, but I didn't, and that's okay. So let's define the ready function. So as you can see, the first thing you'll notice, let's go back here, is that if I attempt to create a function that Godot already knows about, it gives me autocomplete. So we can autocomplete ready. And under ready, we are going to we're going to write some code that will assign the version number property to our label. So what we want to do is we want to take the version number that we just defined as part of our project settings, and we want to append it to the text that's already in the label, which in this case is version. And just to be safe, let me make sure there's a space on the end of it. There is. Okay. So in order to switch back and forth between your 2D view and your script view, you can select the script tab at the top of the screen. So what we've done is we've attached a script to our label node. And since the top of the script says that we're extending label, what we've got is a label, or a new unique node that has all of the functionality of label because it extends label. And it's okay if none of that makes any sense to you. We're going to explain inheritance in a future lesson. So for now, just know that by attaching a script to a node, you have access to everything available in the node. And one of the things available to a label is its text. So we don't even have to define it as a variable because it already exists. So text is going to be the existing text value plus project settings, which is another built-in object that Godot has available to it. And as you might guess, it contains all of the project settings available in the project settings dialog. So we get those values by typing a period, then selecting get setting, and then we have to provide the name of the setting property that we want to get. Now, if you forgot what it was, our version number is application/config/version. So we'll type that in between the quotes here, application/config/version. And also, as you can see while we were typing, Godot, let me see if I can summon that again. So Godot will automatically prompt you with the parameter list that goes in the function so that you won't forget them. So anyway, application/config/version. We're going to learn a lot about scripting in the next lesson. So for now, if it doesn't make a lot of sense, that's okay. So now we save, and now if I go to run my game, version equals prototype 1, which is exactly what we put in our project settings. So what the ready function does is Godot will call this function, and functions are basically just little bits of code that you can define and give a name. So when the version number gets added to the scene tree, so when Godot starts up the game and loads this scene and then adds all of these nodes to the scene, when it adds version number, it will call ready. So what this means is that when ready gets added to the scene, it will change the text to what was already in the text field, and then it will add the project settings and give us what we need. Now, When we do some more work on the game and we want to bump up our version number, we can go back under project settings and we can change the version number to something different, and we won't have to change this code. Godot will automatically read it and it will display it. So by running our game, we can always know what version of our game that we're running, which will be useful to users if they have any problems with your game, because then you can just be like, hey, what version are you running? And they'll be able to tell you from the title screen. So that is it for chapter 2. Join us in chapter 3 when we're going to actually learn how to do some more scripting and create a loading screen so that we can start our game. In this lesson, we're going to do the user interface controls for adding a asynchronous loading screen to our game. And the reason that you would want to do this is because normally when you change scenes in Godot, you're doing what is called a blocking procedure, which means the entire game freezes until all of the files related to the new scene loads. And you don't want that to happen, especially if you want to be able to show any kind of progress indicators or other animations while the loading is occurring so that the user knows that their application hasn't frozen. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go up to Scene, and we are going to select New Scene, and we're going to select User Interface because we're going to create a new control. And just because, we're going to name it Loading Screen. And switch back to the 2D view, and we see that our loading screen has defaulted to the full screen, and if it doesn't, then you can simply go under the anchor presets again and select full rect. Then we're going to add a color rect node, and this will also be a full rect node, and the color rect does exactly what you may think it does. It simply makes a rectangle of a specific color. So if we go over to the inspector, we can select the color that we want it to be. So let's make it black, and we will change the name to background. And we're also going to spell background correctly because that's just the way it works. Next, we are going to add a new container because what we want to do is we want to center our loading widget in the center of the screen, and we want it to be in the center of the screen no matter how big the screen is. Even though technically our screen is only ever going to be one resolution, it's still a good idea to anchor things correctly. So we're going to add what is called a center container. And the center container is again going to be the size of the entire screen. And anything we place in a center container is going to be centered in the center of the screen. But it also has a mild quirk in that every control placed within the center container is only ever going to be as large as it needs to be. So in order to work with this, in addition, so let me just show you a quick example. If I was to add a label to my center container, you can see that it actually has no width because there's no text in it. But now if I were to add text, it's as large as it needs to be. And it is impossible for me to change the size of the label unless I override the custom minimum size, which we'll see in a moment. But it basically defaults to this size, which is fine. But now if we were to add another label, notice that both labels are on top of one another, and we don't want that. So instead of using labels, we are going to use our good friend, the vertical box container. And then within the vertical box container, we're going to place a label. And since I am quickly going to get tired of changing the font and whatnot on just about every label in existence, I'm going to go back to our default theme, and I'm actually going to change it such that all the labels are going to default to the Allegard font that we've been using. And now we don't have to manually set the font on every label that we do. We will simply have to select the correct theme. And since we've already defined this theme, a quick way to assign it would either be to drag it into the dropdown, or we've already worked with it, we can just select click load and quick load, and there will be a list of all of the things that we've recently worked on, so we can just select it from the list. And now we have our Allegard font correctly set. Not particularly thrilled with how large this is though, so we're going to go to theme overrides and we're going to change the font size. Let's make it 45 to make it big. It's a little too big, but yeah, let's go 30. Okay, that's better. Next, we're going to use a new control, and this one is called Texture Progress Bar. The texture progress bar is a way to create a progress bar, and normally in Godot, the progress bars merely have a percentage indicator, but we're actually going to use graphics, 9 patches, the same way that we did for our buttons in order to produce our texture bar. So again, the project resources have already provided you with the loading bar textures we're going to use. So if you'll go into the resources folder of the graphics provided with the lessons, you want loading bar and loading frame, loading underscore bar.png and loading underscore frame.png. And we will drop them into the project in the graphics/UI subfolder. And we are going to, first of all, let's change the name of this to loading bar, or just loading progress, why not? And we want to click the 9-patch stretch option because that will allow us to actually treat our graphics as 9 patches. And we want to expand the stretch margin. And for the images that we've created, unfortunately, we do not have the ability to edit the region like we did with the button graphics that we saw in the previous lesson with the GUI. So in this case, we have to manually set the margins. Fortunately, for our loading frame, the margins are 1 pixel in all directions. So I can simply set these manually. Then we expand textures, and we're not going to use an under texture. The under texture is the texture that provides the background of the bar, but we want our black background to show through. So we're going to leave that empty. Then for over, we're going to provide the loading frame. And for progress, we're going to provide the loading bar. Now, again, you can't really see it because the VBox container is kind of squashing it, and there's really nothing that says, hey, this is supposed to be as large as it needs to be. So we are going to change the sizes. It's actually a good idea for most controls to work with the minimum size, custom minimum size, or just minimum size, instead of the actual size, because the transform size always runs the risk of being overridden by the container. And you will know in most cases that this might happen because Godot is going to warn you, hey, this node is the child of a container, which may mean that it is going to get changed. So we're going to override the custom minimum size. We'll make it 25 in the Y direction. And now, as you can see, we can actually see the frame of our bar as provided in the texture. And we will make the X, we want it to be wider than the loading just because it looks nice. So let's start with 50, and that's not big enough. Let's go with 100. Still isn't big enough. Let's go with 150. There we go. 200, I like it. Now, as you can see, the label is the same size as the progress bar because they're both the size of the VBox container. However, the label is left justified. So if we click on the label, we can go back to horizontal alignment and change it to center. And now we have a progress bar. And if you want to see what the progress bar looks like with something actually in it, we can change the values under the range property in the progress bar. So the minimum and maximum values are the values that the progress bar is going to range from. So on the left, it's going to be 0 all the way to 100 on the right. Step means how many points it's going to change. So for example, if the minimum and maximum values were 100 and step was 10, then the value would get forced to a particular step. So if we made it 25, but the step was 20, then it would get forced to 20. So it would go 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, and so on. And let's just, for the heck of it, let's say it was 50. Then Godot immediately updates the bar to show you what it would look like as 50. But we don't want to do that. We're actually going to be changing the value of this bar programmatically. And now that we've got our loading screen, first thing we're going to do is save it. And we're going to make sure that it is under scenes and UI. And it's called loading screen, which is great. And now in the next lesson, I'm going to show you how to write the script to manipulate this, as well as load a scene from any point within your game. And in so doing, it's going to automatically put this loading screen on top of your display, load the correct scene, and then switch to it.
Hi there! Congratulations on completing this free Godot 2D Essentials course. It's a great achievement, and I hope that you have enjoyed it. You are now equipped with the knowledge to start creating 2D games. If you would like to learn more advanced topics, head over to skillademia.com. Our Beginner to Advanced course offers extensive explanations, hands-on exercises, and practical projects that will help you become proficient in using Godot. You will learn how to set up your project, create scenes, program player mechanics, design interactive elements, and build complex game systems. If this sounds like the next step for you, go check it out. Thank you for watching and see you soon.